Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. I'm excited today to have Dr. Jessica Peck with us today and her brand new resource, Behind Closed Doors, about how to connect with our teenagers. And if this isn't a timely conversation, I don't know what it is. Jessica, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I am super excited to dive right in and to visit with your listeners. Thanks. I really do appreciate it.
So, one of the things that I like to start with is this idea about calling, because I think it's so important. You're a well established nurse practitioner, you've done this for lots of years. How would you describe the calling that God has placed on your life?
Oh, that's a great question. So, I have been fortunate to always follow Jesus. I became a Christian at a very young age and was raised in a Christian home. And I became a nurse and then a nursing faculty. And I always kind of viewed myself as a nurse who was a Christian. And, just that
Mm,
it wasn't so much that they were separate, but in some ways they were. And I really had a turning point when I got my doctoral degree. I was the first woman in my family to go to college, and I started, I published a paper in my policy class, and so started getting invitations to all of these different forums. Long story short, I found myself in Congress, and it was the first time I had ever traveled away from my family, from my husband, from my kids, and I was really scared and kind of thinking, what am I doing here? I have this comfortable little life. Like, do I really need to be doing this? And so I went and met. My assignment was to meet with Ted Cruz right after he had first been elected, and I was so nervous because he had been all over the news for reading Green Eggs and Ham and everything. And when I went in there, I saw that his pants at the knees were super wrinkled, and like they had been over a hanger and not ironed. And so I thought, this is just a guy who puts his pants on one leg at a time. And so I talked with him and did my assignment, and I kind of walked out, and I thought, I did it. And I'll tell you, God just stopped me right there on the Capitol steps and just said, I am with you. And is that enough? And
mm.
are you going to give everything to me? And I thought, okay, that's it. And so from that point on, it wasn't that I was a nurse who was a Christian. I felt like I was a Christian who had a platform of nursing. And it really flipped my mindset. And because faith informs everything that I do. So being able to step out in that has been really exciting. And God's dreams for me are much bigger than any of the ones that I had for myself. My big dream was to have an associate degree in nursing. And God said, no, I've got other plans. And thankfully, I said yes.
I love that. I think that faithful obedience is so important. I'm curious as you step out in writing this book. I mentioned to you pre-recording. It's what I call sneaky Jesus. It's a Christian book with a lot of very practical and research-based applications. How does it feel to have this part of your life now very publicly put out there?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, it really has been made possible because I teach at Baylor, which is a faith based university, and we call ourselves unapologetically Christian. And that is our
Mm.
worldview and what we do. And so my faith has always informed my nursing practice, but you're right. This is the first time I've been really public about it. And the truth is, I take care of patients from all walks of life, from all different kinds of faith. And there's a lot of things that we share, a lot of advice that's applicable to anyone. But my own personal faith, that's where I can speak from authentically and speak to those parents who, have the same faith tradition that I do, who are also Christian and who are struggling with these issues. I see that. And then it's also an invitation for other people to look in and say, hey, this is how I live out my Christian faith. And it's opened a lot of really good conversation.
Now, in the book, you talk a lot about having conversation with your teens, and we're going to talk about all of that. But I love to steal really good practices, if anybody has any, on family devotionals. Is there anything that you do with you've got four teenagers? Is there anything that you do with them to stay rooted in your faith as a family? I mean, outside from the practical stuff that we're going to get to with the book, which is a little bit more situational, any kind of like corporate, like, hey, this is what we do as a family to make sure we're on track.
I think when I first became a mom, I had this idea that, you're supposed to have devotionals every day. And so I would get out the little book and try to, make everything perfect. And it was not perfect. Like, I've got kids crawling on me, like they're bored, they're crying, they're wandering off. Somebody has to go to the bathroom. And so I learned early on that this notion of that kind of perfect little thing was just not real. It was not where we are. So I've really adopted the principles in Deuteronomy about, talk about these things as you walk along the road and as you sit down and as you lie down and as you get up, you go to bed. So really there's times in our family life where we have been able to kind of sit down, like at Christmas time we'll do that. We'll sit down and gather around by,
Mhm.
the fireplace at night and I'll read something or my husband will read something and we may go through a book together. But there's a lot more times that we just have practical faith, where we will listen to a podcast together in the car, where we'll turn on a sermon and listen. One of the best spiritual disciplines that we have as a family is that we always go to church, even if we're traveling. So
Mm.
I'll assign my teenagers when we're going someplace to find a church. So they got to look on the website, what's their theology, what are their beliefs, how do we go and visit. We've had some really great experiences. Like we've been to church in Hawaii where they gave us lays and little smoothies. I mean, my kids wanted to join right there. I think they would have moved their membership. But we've been to a little mountain church in Colorado. We've been to one of the oldest churches in America in Williamsburg, and it's awesome to find God's people everywhere. So that would be the encouragement I would give to parents: is that there's no perfect or right way to do it. It doesn't have to be really structured. Some seasons just aren't made for that, but you can take the opportunity just as you're riding in the car together or as you're just having a spontaneous gathering. All of those things, that's what's really been authentic and worked well for us.
One of the things that I noticed is that this book must have taken a really long time to put together because it's research based, it's scriptural based, it's kind of this really good combination of all the above. So kind of two questions I wanted to ask around that is one, what was the process like of putting it together, and two, how did you know that God was calling you to write a book like this?
These are great questions that nobody's asked me yet. So your listeners are going to get all new information here, which is wonderful.
Thank
So
you.
it did. It in some ways it took a long time, and in some ways it didn't take any time at all. So in the fall of 2019, I had gone to Baylor, and that really changed my life. And the president Linda Livingstone said the world needs a Baylor, and Baylor changed my world because they not only do they say, okay, it's okay for you to be public about your faith, they say, how can we help you? How can we support you? And so that was, kind of just a big life change that happened. I really was not intending to write a book at all. My primary area of expertise right now in nursing is human trafficking. And I look at all the risk factors that bring children to that point. And that's really a lot of things that I discuss in the book. But during the quarantine, I had been talking to a lot more church audiences about human trafficking. So I joined a conference that talk about like speaking. And when I did, they said, "Oh, you should write a book." And I said, "About what?" And they said, "We don't know. Like, just we just think you should write a book." And I thought, I never thought about that. But during the quarantine, I went in my backyard and I just brought my journal and a Bible and I just prayed about it. And within an hour, I had the whole outline done. It just, poured right out of me. And it was just something I think that God had been putting in my heart for years and just preparing me for that moment. Then after that, of course, a lot of it's based on research I had already done or knowledge I had already done. But I met with focus groups of parents. I met with focus groups of teens who had walked through these issues and what would they have wanted from their parents. I met with focus groups of pastors and
Mm.
said, I want to be theologically sound without being theological because that's, not my platform where I am. And yeah, long story short, it's been 2.5 years, 2.5 years from start to finish. So it has definitely been a labor of love.
What have you learned about God in the process?
I'm sorry, say it again. It cut out.
What have you learned about God in the process?
Mm. I have learned that God is faithful. God is so faithful.
Mm.
And I think that, part of this story, part of what is different about this book that I wrote is I shared my personal story. I'm so used to talking from a professional wheelhouse and kind of, oh, here I am in the role of teacher or healthcare provider, where I'm telling you all of these things. But this story, really came from a broken relationship with my parents. And that has not been restored, even to this day, and something that I have prayed for a long time to be restored. And how do I raise kids without having parents of my own? And how am I going to be a good parent if I didn't have that parenting relationship or any wisdom or experience to draw on? And when my oldest daughter was 13, this book starts with her throwing a book at my head while we were driving down the road. And I mean, it was a 4-volume book, so there was some
Oh,
commitment
wow.
there. She chunked it at me, and I just realized, that I had to do something different. And I'm listening. One of my favorite songs right now is CeCe Winans' "The Goodness of God," and when she sings that line, "All my life you have been faithful," I think, if you
Mm.
really mean that, that's hard to say. So that doesn't mean just in the good times, but I'm thinking about some of the lowest points, some of the hardest things, and to say that God has been faithful and that He is a God of restoration, that He gives beauty for ashes, He gives joy for mourning, He exchanges, your garment of despair for a spirit of gladness. I mean, those things, God is faithful to use those things in my life. And I don't think I would have written this book if I hadn't been in that broken place. So to see God being faithful and knowing He's been faithful all my life, that's been really beautiful.
One of the things I appreciate about the way that you write is you're very vulnerable with your own struggles, with your parents, and then also just in some of the ways that your teens struggle too. How does it feel to have kind of have your personal life out there in such a way that it's like, well, you're an expert and you're also not perfect, which as I appreciate as a pastor, that's a posture I often take. Like, hey, this is what the Bible says. This is not how I'm living, but this is what the Bible says.
Yes, that has been such a vulnerable place and kind of awkward, feeling. But what I've discovered is that we have actually, when I was talking with my team this morning, we talked about a secret society of broken parents and how
Mm,
that's why the book is called Behind Closed Doors. Because we, especially in the church, I think there's such this pressure to present a good front, like, oh, I have it all together, everything's fine. And that's one of the things I say. I even see in practice coming in, the family that you're envying over and social media is actually divorcing. The teen that you wish your teen was like is has suicidal thoughts and behaviors. But there's such this stigma of talking about it. And I see, we can talk about toddlers having trouble potty training with no problem. There will be 500 comments on the mom's Facebook page. But if you say my child has mental health struggles, silence. So I felt like it was really important for me to be authentic and to share, my daughter has anxiety. My brother has addiction, and addiction runs in my family, and these are things I've struggled with. And I think it's important for me to set that example and to say, hey, we're all broken, um, but there is hope, and there is healing, and there's restoration, and there is freedom and truth. That is that's really powerful.
yeah, I love that. I also really love to read dedication pages, and you have a very robust dedication page. And
Okay.
I'm going to read the first couple of lines for my audience
Okay.
and kind of get your reflection on it. So it says, with great admiration, appreciation, and affection, I dedicate this book to my 4 children. They embrace our family mantra of to whom much is given, much is required. They are an integral supportive force in this book journey. I'm curious, how has writing this book impacted them?
I'm sorry. Say it one more time, Tony.
How has writing this book impacted them?
Okay. Oh, this is a great question. So, one of the things that I was really struggling with when I decided to step out onto this public platform was how much I was going to involve my kids, because just because I have a public persona does not obligate them to have a public persona and to be in the public. And I know there's lots of people who share their kids publicly, but from my experience working with kids and working with human trafficking and online exploitation, that was just something that I wasn't willing to do. And at first, I kind of was advised, "Hey, well, you may not look authentic," but I just decided, you know what, I'm just going to leave that to the Lord. But the thing that so that's why you won't see my kids on social media. I do share things about them, but I share them with their permission. So the stories I share in the book about
Mm.
them, they helped me write, they helped me edit, they wanted me to share, what we chose to share. And actually, my oldest daughter, I haven't even told anybody this. You're getting all the best information here. My oldest daughter, who's a sophomore at Baylor, is actually going to start writing a blog for me to accompany behind closed doors to kind of say, all right, yeah, that's my mom's perspective. Here's my perspective as a Gen Z.
Oh, that's
Um,
awesome.
yeah, but it is awesome. I'm super excited about it. But the main thing, the best compliment that my kids have ever given me is because it's embarrassing, right? Like they have a mom who talks about sex at their school. Like that's embarrassing. But they've never told me they're embarrassed of me. They always say, I'm so grateful that you do this. And they bring their friends to me all the time. I have a counseling chair in my office. I will frequently come home and there's some kids sitting in there that they said, you need to talk to them. So they have been such a support, just teaching me so much about what it's like. And that's what I think about parents today. There's this disconnect between what we want the world to look like for our kids and what it actually looks like. And so, if we want to influence our kids' worldview, we have to view the world as they see it. And unless we listen and
Mm.
really get on their level and get in their world and see what they're seeing, we're not going to have the influence that we can if we're just listening. So I love to learn from my kids. They are my joy, my everything. And actually, when I was president of the National Association of Pediatric Nurse Practitioners, I get to give a president's award, and usually, you give it to somebody who's helped you write a paper or something. I said, "Oh no, this is going to my kids," and so I was able to, help recognize them, and they still have it on their nightstand. Like, I mean, what more could I ask for as a mom?
That's amazing. And your husband's a rocket scientist, so you're a doctor. He's a rocket scientist. Do your kids ever feel like um, they won't measure up? I mean, how do you guys reconcile with that? Do you talk about that? Like, that's got to be a real. A mentor of mine always says, if you're a high functioning adult, one of your jobs is to turn the heat down in the room when you walk in with your kids. How do you and your husband navigate that?
So that is really hard because, my husband is a rocket scientist. He has two graduate degrees, and I have a doctor of nursing practice. He is amused by the perception that I'm the smart one in this relationship when he is a literal rocket scientist. And my kids will be quick to say that. They're like, yeah, there's a disagreement there. The rocket scientist is going to win. But it is hard. And I'll tell you, our two oldest kids, they're very high performing. The first one was valedictorian. The second one is on track to do the same. And our younger two are not that interested in that. And so we have really, I mean, like, what do they want? People say, what do they want to be? I'm like, they want to be outside. That's what they want to be right now, just outside playing, which is great. And I think that, it is hard. I think sometimes there is that pressure. I'm not going to say that there's not. But at the same time, we are very intentional about embracing every aspect of our kids' personalities and recognizing their strengths and recognizing that our youngest is the typical youngest. His strength is he makes us laugh. We would be very boring people without him in our life. And whatever they want to do, we just tell them, whatever you want to do, just do it unto the Lord, and we're going to support you, and we're going to do
Mm.
that. And I hope that I hope that they know that. But the oldest two have set the bar high, and that pressure is there. And so, just emphasizing and looking for the other strengths in their personalities is something that we really take very seriously.
One of my favorite tools in the book is an acronym, LOVE. I was hoping that you might take us through that so that the people listening kind of get a feel for when they pick up their copy, how practical and just, I mean, these are, you're giving some real tools pretty easily that are easy to grasp onto on how they can engage their teen differently. And I think this is important for grandparents who might have teenage grandchildren as it is for parents who have teenagers like myself. So, can you kind of take us through that acronym?
Yes, I would love to do that because, yes, this is not a book that you're going to read and just say, oh, well, that's nice to know. That's good and informed my view. No, this is an invitation to a Jumanji style parenting adventure. Like, it's roll up your sleeves, it's muddy boots, it is, you're going to get your feelings hurt. There's going to be injuries along the way, but it is so worth it in the end. So, yes, I wanted to give parents really practical hands on tools. So, the Love Your Teen model is something that I created, modifying a professional tool we use in practice called motivational interviewing. And usually, our response when we talk to teens, as soon as they tell us something, we don't really listen. Like if they say, something that we think is unwise or they're thinking about doing, or we find out that they're doing something, we immediately launch into lecture mode. And we're like, how could you do that? What are you thinking about? No, that is not a good idea. But what I've found is that using this is how I talk to teens. People call me the teen whisperer here in the
Mm.
community because they're like, "How do you know all these things?" I'm like, "I just use this simple tool." So here you go. I'll walk you through it. So L is listen with your face. We do not listen with our face. I mean, you think, parents think, how many times have you been talking to your spouse and they're not paying attention and you say you're not listening, and the first thing that they say back to you is always, "I am listening. Yes, I am." And then they'll repeat back everything you say. We don't feel heard. So we are often guilty of
Mm.
phubbing our teens, phone snubbing our teens. There's actually a lot of research about this. It decreases the chemicals that we have in our brain that make us feel like we bond. So they feel disconnected, they feel disrespected, they have a lower opinion of us. So you just need to put down your phone, stop what you're doing, pull over the car, and look at them and listen with their face. Then when they say something, don't give statements back. Offer open-ended questions first. Let the first word out of your mouth be a question. How is that making you feel? Tell me more about how that's impacting you. And I give in the book specific, hints for that. You can write them on your hand if you want to, while you're cheating and learning. And then V is validate the emotion. So we can validate the emotion without validating the action. So, for example, your teen doesn't study, they go to school, they get a bad grade. You're not shocked at all. They come home, you could say, I told you you should have studied. Or you can say, I see this is really upsetting to you. What can I do to support you in changing your decision making? It's a totally different a mindset. And then E is explore next steps together. So instead of telling them you're going to do this and you're going to do that, say, okay, what do you think you need to do to change this situation? Making them feel empowered and like they're having some decision making. I'm telling you, if you practice this model, I promise you, if you intentionally do it a year from now, you will be in a completely different place with your team than you are right now.
Yeah, as I read it, it seemed very practical and very applicable, and like, hey, I could do this. Here's the $1 million question for me. I'm a very passionate guy. I can get very fired up about things, even when I don't mean to. How do I detach? And I'm speaking for other emotional people out here. How do I detach my emotions from my child's actions?
Great question. I should also mention at this point that my rocket scientist husband is Italian, so I understand fiery emotions. Definitely have learned that from his
Yeah.
family. But I think that what you need to do is picture yourself in that place before it happens. That's usually what happens is we're blindsided. We don't see something coming and we are angry. And usually it's not we're not angry at our teen. We're angry that something has threatened what we see as their construct of security, threatened their future, threatened, some way forward in their path. And so our immediate response is just anger. How could you do that? And it's so hard to do. But if you just practice this simple response in any situation, if you say, "This news is upsetting. Let's take a minute to let our emotions settle down before we talk about this. I want to walk away, but before we do that, I want you to know that no matter what, I love you and we'll find a way to talk through this." And if you need to do that, then just do that, because the words that we say in those moments, they permanently shape our children's view of themselves. Because people think kids don't care what you have to say. That's just not true. They really care what you have to say.
Mm,
They listen intently, especially to what you say about them specifically. And more importantly, they believe everything you say about them. So when we see our kid with a particular behavioral struggle, like say they're struggling with being on time, or they're struggling with lying, or they're struggling with risk taking behaviors, just anything, we don't want to say, "Oh, you're such a liar. Oh, you're so lazy." I can generalize it to their character. We have to believe in their future and say, "You're a great kid who's struggling with being on time right now. You're a great kid who's just
mm,
making some poor choices. So how can we get you back on track?" I cannot under emphasize. I mean, I can't overemphasize how important that is. I mean, it really does, because when I see kids in practice, when I talk to teens, they tell me everything their parent thinks about them. Oh, my dad thinks that I'm no good. My dad thinks, now if I go talk to the dad, he's not going to say that. He says, no, I love my kid.
sure.
There's that disconnect in communication, and that's what I'm trying to bridge.
Yeah, one of the things that I see is that this is a lot more about the parent than it is about the teen. Parenting teens is really about our own stuff. I think that there are probably a lot of parents who are listening who are going, man, I wish I had that when I grew up.
Mm.
Now I need to give it to my kids. How do we break, and I'm going to use a church term for it because I don't have great language, but how do we break the generational sin in family of where I mean, you mentioned addiction, but there's lots of things that over the years have separated parents from kids. How do we break the cycle?
Well, I'll use a healthcare term. We call it generational trauma. I mean, it is a
Mm,
real thing. And I know I struggled with that. I thought, when my daughter threw that book at my head, I thought, here we go. I'm looking at a long line of broken mother daughter relationships, and I'm just going to be another
wow.
statistic in there. And I really had to just embrace God's truth on that and see that it is possible to break that cycle. Now you've got to do the work, and that is really hard. And for me, I'll be really transparent. That involved counseling. I needed a counselor to help me work through all of that, and that was really helpful. But what parents need to know is that when we don't break that generational trauma or generational sin, it makes us in a constant state of stress, and that stress releases chemicals in our body that literally damage our organs, damage our blood vessels. You think about if you're in the woods with a bear and you see a bear and you're afraid, that's a good response. If you're in the woods and there's a bear. But with generational trauma, we bring that bear home with us, and you're in that constant fight or flight state. And it changes the way our DNA is read and transcribed. And so that's how we pass on generational trauma. And so that's one of the things that I try to do in behind closed doors is really challenge parents to look at their own hearts and say, what do you need to deal with in your past? You need to deal with your hurt and find healing so that doesn't become your teen's hurt. Now, I'll confess, there are some things that I still struggle with, as a result of the trauma that I've experienced, and I'll tell my kids, "Hey, I'm so sorry that you have to deal with this, but it's better. It's better every time, and I hope your children are even better." And just even being able to name and claim those feelings and talk about
Mm,
it. I just posted a quote from Mr. Rogers yesterday about anything that's mentionable is manageable, and anything that's manageable we
yeah.
can we can discuss, and if we talk about our feelings, they're a little less scary, we're a little less alone, and that is really important. And I already see that, paying dividends, and that's really exciting to me.
Yeah, the format for the book is kind of it's got three different doors, is the way you talk about it: clinic, home, and heart. And each door kind of is another part, another way to look at the same topic. And then throughout the course of the book, that you go through some. I mean, you basically hit every hard hitting topic that happens in the world today. Which kudos to you. That's a lot of bravery. um, I'm curious. There's probably a parent listening who feels disconnected and they don't even know which hard hitting topic they're in right now. What's the first step for a parent who wants to re-engage their teen and try to heal the wound that's maybe festered up between the two of them?
That is a really good question. So the first step is for the parent to acknowledge that it's time to get help. That's really it. How
Hmm.
many times do we just sit in misery? We really do that. If you had a sore throat and a fever, you would pick up the phone and call your primary healthcare provider and say, I need to get in, and probably today. But if you are having conflict, if you are having dysfunctional relationship patterns, we're always, well, let's just wait it out. Let me Google search a little bit and see what I can find. It's going to help me. Let me listen to a podcast, like this one. But I think coming to that moment where you say, you know what, this is it. This is the moment. This cannot continue. We've got to do something different. And then it takes a village around you. You can't do it alone. I read
Mhm.
Gallup said 81% of Americans will rely on Google to information search, but only 16% will share with a trusted friend about a challenge they're having. Something is wrong, Tony,
Wow.
if we don't have enough confidence to talk to a trusted friend about a struggle we're having, but we're confident enough in our Google search to handle it. And that's how these patterns just continue. So reach out to somebody you trust. That might be a pastor, that might be a healthcare provider, might be a counselor, might be just somebody, a mentor that you have, and just say, "Hey, guess what's going on behind closed doors? Like, this is what I'm dealing with." And then making those steps forward to actually do something about it. And there's no magic cure, right? There's no easy fix. This is a messy looping back and forth, hills and valleys, mountains and plateaus. But those are the important things to do.
So I'm going to ask you to do something that's very unfair, and I'm going to ask you to speak to church leaders
Ooh,
because I really believe that one of the things that the church has really dropped the ball on is this idea of engaging teens with something more than just a fun youth group. Although fun youth group is super important, but if we look at mass violence in America, it's a really interesting character of a 17-year-old white male from a rural or suburban community. And what's happened is we haven't done a great job of engaging the teenagers who are on the margins. So if you were going to draw up a prescription plan for the local church, what would you tell them to do?
that is, oh, I wish that this could be like reality. I'm going to send it out to every church. The first thing that I would do is tell church leaders to help parents and youth leaders engage in meaningful conversation with teens. The church, frankly, does a terrible job of equipping teens to meet the challenges of today. And we don't talk about those things. The messages that we give are things like, don't have sex, it's bad. Don't do drugs. Modest is hottest, save yourself for marriage, and then when they do find themselves in these positions, they have no trusted adult that they can go to. They have terrible shame, and so they try to figure it out on their own. And that is just leads to a spiral of destructive behavior. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen it in my practice. I have a student who engages in sexting, doesn't know how to get out of that, starts feeling depressed and anxious, starts self harming, starts using substances to numb that pain, and the parents have no idea what's going on. And that's not an indictment on parents at all. It's
Mm,
just a reality check. It's a gut check that we cannot adopt the "not my kid" mantra. And when we, have some kids are just better at pretending than other kids, but we have to have
right.
a an environment in church youth groups. I agree. Like, have fun and bring them in, but we've got to have meaningful conversation. The number one predictor of childhood resilience to trauma, which what you're talking about, all of these, kids on the fringe and on the margin who commit acts of violence, they almost always have childhood trauma, and they have abuse that is unaddressed. And so we have to have an environment where they can come in and be honest about that. And the number one predictive factor of their recovery is meaningful connection to an adult in their life. So we got to get them connected to somebody,
Mm.
whether that's a youth pastor, whether that is a Sunday school teacher, whether that is their parent, or whether that's a mentor or a coach or a teacher or somebody. They need somebody to connect with. Because every single one of those kids, they did not have any meaningful connection to an adult who was speaking truth and grace in their life.
Yeah, we should send that out to every pastor. That's so good.
Well, they think, I don't
Okay.
wanna give teens I don't wanna give them ideas. Okay, let me just tell you this. I'm gonna tell you this straight up as a
Yeah.
pediatric nurse practitioner. Kids already have ideas, and they're all bad. Like, they're terrible ideas. They have ideas, and they're not wise, and they're not well thought out. And so, yes, please, let's give them ideas. I want to give my teens ideas. I want to give them good ideas.
So, I have one more question for you, but before I ask it, I know that my listeners are going to want to connect with you all over the internet. Where is the best thing to learn all things Jessica Peck, and where we can pick up the next book that I'm sure is already coming out? Already, you're already working on, but where can we hear about what God is doing in and through your ministry?
You can, I would love for your listeners to connect to my podcast. That is brand new, just started recently, the Dr. Nurse Mama podcast. I previously hosted a podcast that was really for nurses, but this one's for parents. We walk through each chapter of the book, and I co host it with a pastor, actually, a local pastor here, where we talk about the intersection of health and faith. And I ask the pastor all the tough questions, just like you're asking me all the tough questions today. But, we really talk about those things like stigma of mental health in the church and how, the church over spiritualizes mental health and all of those things. Like you said, I mean, we go there. And so I'd love to see them there. You can find me on my website at drnursemama.com, drnursemama.com. And you can find me on Facebook and Instagram. I actually have a book club going on right now on social media where I post information. We're taking 1 month to go through each chapter. We're just starting mental health. I'm inviting a community of parents that jump in and just, engage with my content, find other parents who are there, and we're going and we're going to share our experiences about trying these conversation settings and conversation keys. I'll share some of my successes and failures. So those are the places that you can find me.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, last question I love to ask people. It's an advice question, except I get to name the season of life that you're in when you go back to give yourself one piece of advice. And
Ooh.
so, yeah, this is a hard one. So I'd like to take you back to the very first day after you came home with your now 19-year-old child.
Mm.
If you could pull up a chair and sit knee to knee with that new, certainly tired, excited mom, the version of yourself that you are right then,
Mm.
what's the one piece of advice you're going to give her?
Wow. Honestly, that's a little emotional. So I'll tell you, I'll tell you who I'm talking to. If I'm talking to that mom, she's in her mid 20s. She is terribly insecure, terribly afraid that she is going to mess up this child for life. terribly secretive, that people are going to find out that this baby has colic and doesn't eat well and is really unhappy and doesn't seem to like her mother at all already, even when she's a newborn.
Mm,
Oh, and feeling so alone and so afraid, but pressure to keep up this professional persona because this is what you do for a living. And how are you going to do this? I would tell her that I would tell her that the Lord is a sun and a shield. He gives grace and glory. No good thing does
mm,
he withhold from those who walk uprightly. He is going to light your path. He is going to protect you. He is going to walk you through with glory. I was reading about in the Greek comes from the word doxa, which means the physical weight of God's presence. That He is going to be with you, and that God is a God of redemption, and He is going to use this story for His good and for His glory. And your daughter is going to be the greatest blessing you could have ever, ever wanted to give, and everything you're dreaming about having, you will have. Woo! Tony, you got me. That's
mm. Amen. Amen. And what a beautiful place to end our time together. Jessica, thank you for being so generous and vulnerable and honest and wise and for dealing with all the tough questions I threw your way. I can't wait to see what God does next.
Thank you so much for having me, Tony. I really appreciate it. And thank you for all that you do to equip your listeners with hope and life and just community. I really value that and appreciate that very much.